Some ancient texts do not simply tell stories, they behave more like moving atmospheric systems, carrying layered meanings that shift depending on how they are observed. Language, symbolism, geography, and later scientific imagination all overlap, creating a space where interpretation becomes as important as the text itself. This exploration begins with an interdisciplinary frame of analysis, where ancient Hebrew language, natural phenomena, and modern physical models are placed side by side, not to collapse them into one explanation, but to observe how human understanding evolves across time. The objective here is not to uncover a single definitive truth hidden beneath the text, but rather to examine how terms such as Ruach, the imagery of the chariot of fire, and the narrative of Elijah and Elisha can be interpreted across multiple epistemic layers. In one reading, the story belongs to the symbolic domain, where wind becomes spirit, motion becomes divine agency, and fire becomes transformation. In another, more speculative modern reading, these descriptions are loosely compared to concepts in fluid dynamics, plasma behavior, or field theory. These frameworks do not merge cleanly, but their tension reveals how interpretation itself changes depending on intellectual context. If you are following this as a continuing series of explorations into ancient symbolism and modern reinterpretation, consider subscribing and following the channel, as each section gradually builds a different interpretive layer: linguistic, symbolic, and speculative. The scope of this narrative is anchored in Hebrew texts referencing Ruach, the chariot of fire, and the transition between Elijah and Elisha. These narratives are not isolated abstractions, they are rooted in the geography of the ancient Levant and the Jordan Valley, regions characterized by tectonic instability, dry winds, and dramatic landscapes. In such environments, natural forces were not merely observed, they were experienced as expressive, almost communicative events. The land itself appears to have shaped how phenomena were described, not as neutral mechanics, but as meaningful occurrences. Moving into linguistic analysis, the central term Ruach emerges as a key conceptual bridge. In ancient Hebrew, it resists reduction to a single definition. It can mean wind, breath, or spirit, depending on context. This semantic flexibility, known as polysemy, means that Ruach functions less like a technical term and more like a dynamic field of meaning. It connects physical sensation with inner life, external environment with internal experience. From a modern perspective, there is a tendency to map Ruach onto physical systems such as atmospheric turbulence or localized vortex structures. One might imagine wind as a complex fluid system where energy does not flow linearly but forms swirling, unstable patterns. In this analogy, Ruach becomes visually similar to dynamic airflow systems studied in fluid mechanics. However, it is crucial to emphasize that such a comparison is interpretive rather than evidential. The original texts do not describe meteorological systems in scientific terms. They express perception through poetic and theological language. A common interpretive error arises when Ruach is equated directly with a measurable physical vortex, as if ancient authors were encoding scientific descriptions of atmospheric behavior. This approach overlooks the literary and liturgical nature of the text. In ancient Hebrew narrative, wind is rarely just wind. It is often a sign, a presence, or a transition between states of being. The language is designed to evoke meaning, not to specify physical mechanisms. By collapsing Ruach into a purely physical construct, one risks stripping the term of its layered cultural and theological significance. What is lost is not just metaphor, but the entire expressive framework in which natural phenomena and spiritual interpretation were inseparable. In this worldview, a strong wind is not merely air in motion, it can represent judgment, transition, or the movement of unseen forces within a cosmological order. Therefore, reading Ruach through a modern scientific lens should be understood as a secondary interpretive layer, not a replacement for the original semantic field. It becomes a way of reflecting on how human cognition translates experience across different conceptual systems, ancient symbolic thinking on one side and modern physical modeling on the other. As this exploration continues beyond language into imagery, narrative transformation, and speculative physics analogies, the goal is not to resolve these perspectives into a single explanation, but to trace how meaning itself shifts, moving from wind to spirit, from symbol to model, and from ancient perception to modern interpretation. Continuing from the linguistic and symbolic foundation established earlier, the narrative now moves from the semantics of Ruach into one of the most visually intense and conceptually unstable images in the entire tradition, the Chariot of Fire. This is where language stops behaving like description and begins functioning like a controlled explosion of imagery, dense, luminous, and resistant to literal interpretation. In the original textual context, the phrase commonly rendered as Chariot of Fire does not come with any technical specification. There is no mechanical blueprint, no engineering description, and no attempt to explain propulsion, structure, or material composition. What exists instead is a compressed visual event, a moving object associated with intense brightness, fire-like appearance, and vertical or transcendent motion. The narrative does not behave like a technical report. It behaves like an eyewitness account, filtered through symbolic language, where perception and meaning are inseparable. From this perspective, the chariot is first and foremost a vehicle in the most general sense, a structure associated with movement and transition. The addition of fire fundamentally alters its ontological status. Fire here does not function as a fuel source or combustion process in a modern engineering sense. Instead, it behaves as a visual and symbolic intensifier, suggesting overwhelming luminosity, transformative energy, and boundary dissolution between ordinary matter and extraordinary presence. The result is not a machine in the modern sense, but an image that resists reduction to physical description. When interpreted symbolically, the Chariot of Fire can be understood as a representation of transition between states of existence. It marks not simply movement through space, but movement between categories of being, human to non-human, material to immaterial, visible to invisible. In many ancient narrative systems, fire often occupies this liminal role. It consumes, transforms, and reveals simultaneously. Thus, the image may be functioning less as a report of an object and more as a structured metaphor for irreversible transformation. In some modern speculative readings, attempts are made to draw analogies between this imagery and advanced physical concepts such as plasma dynamics, ionized atmospheric systems, or high-energy luminous phenomena. One might imagine a structure surrounded by intense electromagnetic activity, producing light emissions that obscure its physical boundaries. Concepts like plasma propulsion or ionized airflow are sometimes invoked as loose comparative frameworks. However, these comparisons must be treated carefully. They do not imply historical technological correspondence. Rather, they reflect the human tendency to reinterpret ancient imagery through the vocabulary of contemporary science. The similarity is visual and conceptual, not evidential or causal. The key distinction here is between analogy and identity. While modern plasma systems can produce intense luminosity and visually unstable structures, the Chariot of Fire exists in a narrative environment where physical laws are not being described, but meaning is being constructed. The ancient text is not encoding engineering knowledge. It is producing a symbolic event that communicates authority, transition, and separation from ordinary reality. This leads naturally into the historical question: what kind of event is actually being described? Was there a physical migration, a social transition, or something entirely symbolic encoded in narrative form? The figure of Elijah, along with Elisha as his successor, appears within a broader historical and cultural landscape that may reflect real social movements in the ancient Levant region. One plausible reading is that the narrative preserves echoes of displacement, leadership transition, or institutional change within a community situated around the Jordan Valley. In such a reading, the ascension motif does not necessarily indicate a literal departure into the sky. Instead, it may represent disappearance from the social field, an exit from public life, death, or transformation of authority structures. Ancient texts frequently use vertical movement, going up, being taken, as a metaphor for status change rather than physical relocation. In this sense, heavenly ascent functions as a linguistic mechanism for marking the end of one narrative role and the continuation of another. The symbolic layer reinforces this interpretation. Across multiple ancient traditions, ascending often signifies transition into a divine or non-human category of existence. It does not require physical movement through atmospheric space. Instead, it indicates a change in ontological classification within the cultural system. A figure taken upward is often being removed from ordinary historical continuity and placed into a mythic or sacred register. When these two layers, the historical and the mythopoetic, are placed side by side, the narrative becomes bifurcated rather than singular. On one side, there is a plausible framework of social and historical transformation within an ancient Near Eastern context. On the other, there is a structured mythic expression that encodes meaning through elevation, fire, and disappearance. Neither layer invalidates the other. Instead, they operate as parallel interpretive systems. Thus, the departure of Elijah can be read in two fundamentally different ways. In a literal historical frame, it may reflect an event of disappearance or transition within a real community structure. In a mythopoetic frame, it becomes a narrative mechanism for expressing transcendence, continuity of authority, and separation from the material world. The tension between these readings is precisely what allows the text to remain active across centuries of interpretation, continuously reinterpreted through new intellectual lenses without collapsing into a single fixed explanation. Continuing from the previous layers of linguistic, symbolic, and narrative analysis, the framework now shifts into a more physically speculative register, where human imagination attempts to map ancient imagery onto modern concepts of motion, energy, and space. This transition is not meant to validate technological interpretations of the text, but to observe how contemporary thought systems instinctively seek physical analogies for experiences originally expressed in symbolic language. Within this context, the idea of biological transport versus technological ascension emerges as a conceptual contrast. On one side lies the human body as a biological system constrained by well-established physical limits. Any vertical acceleration applied to a human body generates measurable effects: increasing gravitational load, G-force, redistribution of blood flow, neurological stress, and in extreme cases, loss of consciousness or structural tissue damage. These responses are not theoretical. They are well documented in aerospace medicine and high-acceleration research environments. The human organism, in its current biological form, does not possess any known mechanism capable of naturally mitigating extreme vertical acceleration through external protective phenomena such as fire or luminous shielding. Yet within the narrative imagery under discussion, there appears a concept that resembles an external protective envelope, often described metaphorically as a fiery covering or luminous boundary. From a modern interpretive standpoint, this can be loosely compared to high-energy fields such as plasma envelopes or intense photonic emissions surrounding an object. In physical terms, plasma is an ionized state of matter capable of emitting strong light and interacting with electromagnetic fields. However, even in advanced theoretical models, such structures remain governed by thermodynamic and electromagnetic constraints. They do not function as biological protection systems, nor do they confer immunity to inertial forces on living organisms in any verified scientific framework. Nevertheless, the comparison becomes intellectually interesting when considered as a metaphorical bridge rather than a literal equivalence. The layer of fire in the narrative may be interpreted as a symbolic representation of boundary dissolution, an indication that the object or being involved is transitioning beyond the constraints of ordinary physical interaction. In this sense, fire is not protection in a mechanical sense, but a visual marker of transformation, signaling that normal categories of matter, motion, and visibility no longer apply. When modern speculative physics enters the discussion, concepts such as plasma propulsion, magnetohydrodynamic flow, and ionized atmospheric thrust systems are sometimes invoked as loose analogical structures. Plasma propulsion systems, for example, rely on accelerating ionized particles using electromagnetic fields to generate thrust. Magnetohydrodynamics describes the behavior of electrically conductive fluids in magnetic fields, while ionized atmospheric thrust refers to the manipulation of charged particles in air to produce movement or lift. These systems, while real in experimental or theoretical engineering contexts, operate within strictly defined physical laws and energy constraints. What is important in this comparative exercise is not functional equivalence, but structural resemblance at the level of imagination. The ancient imagery describes motion accompanied by intense luminosity and boundary distortion. Modern physics describes systems where energy, ionization, and electromagnetic fields can produce visually similar effects under controlled conditions. However, similarity of appearance does not imply similarity of meaning, mechanism, or intent. The ancient narrative is not describing propulsion technology. It is constructing a symbolic event of transition that modern language retroactively maps onto technological analogies. This tension between symbolic imagery and physical interpretation becomes even more pronounced when the geographical context is considered. The Jordan Rift Valley, situated within a major tectonic boundary system, is a real geological structure formed by the divergence of the African and Arabian plates. This region is characterized by seismic activity, fault lines, and variations in geological stress. From a purely physical standpoint, it is a zone where energy is continuously redistributed through the Earth's crust over long timescales. In speculative interpretive frameworks, such environments are sometimes associated with heightened electromagnetic variability or localized atmospheric disturbances. These associations are not part of established geological theory, but they reflect a tendency to link dramatic natural landscapes with equally dramatic narrative events. In other words, the mind maps intensity in story onto intensity in geography. The result is an interpretive overlay where symbolic vortices or ruptures in narrative space are imagined as corresponding to physical irregularities in the environment. However, when returning to the textual level, the idea of spatial cracks or discontinuities should be understood primarily as metaphor. Ancient languages often use spatial disruption to represent existential transition. A gap or opening in the sky, for example, does not imply a physical tear in spacetime, but rather a shift in perceptual or ontological framing. What appears to be a rupture in space is, at the level of narrative structure, a transformation in how reality is being described. This leads to a critical conceptual boundary, the idea of disappearance. Modern physics, as currently understood, does not support the notion that macroscopic objects can simply vanish without trace. Matter and energy may transform, redistribute, or change state, but they do not cease to exist in an absolute sense within known physical laws. Conservation principles remain foundational. In contrast, ancient narrative systems frequently describe disappearance not as physical annihilation, but as transition into another mode of existence. Thus, when a figure is described as no longer present, the statement operates within a symbolic grammar rather than a physical one. It may indicate withdrawal from the observable world, transformation into a sacred category, or relocation into a domain beyond human perception. The emphasis is not on mechanism, but on relational absence, how the figure is positioned relative to the community, the narrative, and the cosmos. Across these layers, biological limitation, speculative technological analogy, geological context, and symbolic absence, the text maintains a consistent pattern. It resists reduction to a single explanatory domain. Instead, it functions as a multi-layered structure where meaning is distributed across language, imagery, environment, and interpretive projection. The modern reader, attempting to integrate these layers, inevitably oscillates between metaphor and mechanism, between narrative and physics, without fully collapsing one into the other. This oscillation is not a failure of interpretation, but its core dynamic. It is precisely this tension that allows ancient narratives to remain intellectually active across millennia, continuously reconfigured through the conceptual tools of each new era. As the interpretive framework continues to expand, the narrative gradually shifts away from physical analogy and enters a more abstract conceptual domain, one where time, perception, and dimensionality are no longer treated as fixed structures, but as flexible constructs shaped by both scientific theory and philosophical imagination. This transition marks a movement from descriptive interpretation toward cognitive modeling, how humans conceptualize reality when confronted with phenomena that resist linear explanation. Within theoretical physics, the idea of additional spatial dimensions beyond the familiar three has long been explored. In frameworks such as string theory, the universe is not limited to the observable dimensions of length, width, and height. Instead, it is proposed that additional compactified dimensions may exist, curled at scales far beyond direct detection. These extra dimensions are not empirical observations, but mathematical necessities arising from attempts to unify fundamental forces. Importantly, while such models are internally consistent within their mathematical structure, they remain experimentally unverified. When such ideas are loosely connected to ancient narratives, particularly those involving ascent, disappearance, or transformation, there is a tendency to metaphorically reinterpret movement upward as movement into higher dimensional space. In this interpretive leap, the phrase "taken up" is no longer understood as vertical motion in physical space, but as a transition into a different structural layer of reality. However, this remains a metaphorical extension rather than a scientifically grounded equivalence. The mathematical concept of additional dimensions does not imply accessible alternate realms of experience in the narrative or perceptual sense described in ancient texts. Closely related to this is the notion of non-linear time, a concept that appears in both theoretical physics and philosophical discussions of temporality. In certain physical models, such as those involving relativistic spacetime, time is not absolute, but dependent on reference frames, curvature, and velocity. In philosophy, time is often examined not as a flowing sequence of discrete moments, but as a constructed experience shaped by consciousness. However, neither framework supports the idea of practical time travel as commonly depicted in narrative fiction. When applied to ancient textual interpretation, non-linear time becomes a useful metaphor for understanding narrative recurrence. Events such as the appearance or reappearance of figures like Elijah in later interpretive traditions are not necessarily claims about physical return, but about the persistence of narrative identity across time. A figure may return in later texts, traditions, or symbolic systems, not as a physical entity, but as a reactivated conceptual structure within cultural memory. In this sense, recurrence is not temporal inversion, but interpretive re-emergence. This brings the analysis into the eighth conceptual layer, cognitive perception and altered states of interpretation. The imagery of the Chariot of Fire, when examined through this lens, can be understood as a high-intensity perceptual construct rather than a mechanically defined object. In cognitive terms, extreme symbolic imagery often functions to compress multiple emotional, theological, and perceptual meanings into a single visual frame. Such frames are not intended to be passed as technical descriptions, but experienced as unified events of meaning. From this perspective, transformation from object to energy in narrative language does not correspond to any known physical process at macroscopic scale. In physics, matter-energy conversion occurs under specific conditions and conservation constraints, typically at subatomic levels or in high-energy environments, such as particle interactions. There is no known mechanism by which a macroscopic biological entity undergoes direct transformation into energy in the way symbolic narratives might imply. Therefore, when such transformation appears in text, it should be understood as metaphorical compression rather than physical description. In narrative systems, disappearance often functions as a symbolic substitution for ontological transition. Instead of representing annihilation, it indicates removal from the perceptual or social frame of reference. The subject is no longer accessible within the same domain of observation. This allows the narrative to preserve continuity of meaning while eliminating physical presence. The result is not a violation of physical law, but a shift in representational logic. A related concept emerges in the discussion of frequency change, which is sometimes invoked in modern reinterpretations of symbolic ascent or disappearance. In physics, frequency refers to the rate of oscillation in wave phenomena, such as electromagnetic radiation or sound. It is a measurable property with strict mathematical definition. However, in interpretive or metaphorical usage, frequency is often employed to describe shifts in state, awareness, or perception. In this metaphorical sense, a change in frequency does not refer to electromagnetic variation, but to a transition in cognitive framing, how reality is being perceived and structured by consciousness. When applied to ancient narratives, this metaphor suggests that what changes is not the physical object itself, but the interpretive accessibility of that object within a given perceptual system. A figure becomes invisible not because it ceases to exist physically, but because it is no longer represented within the same narrative or experiential domain. This aligns with broader patterns in symbolic literature, where visibility and existence are often closely linked at the level of meaning construction. Across these layered interpretations, higher dimensional frameworks, non-linear temporality, narrative recurrence, cognitive transformation, and metaphorical frequency shifts, the central tension remains consistent. Each modern conceptual system offers tools for reinterpreting ancient imagery, yet none fully replaces the original symbolic function of the text. Instead, they coexist as parallel lenses, one rooted in narrative and theological expression, the other in mathematical and physical abstraction. The result is not convergence into a single explanation, but a structured plurality of readings. Ancient narratives like those involving Elijah continue to operate as open systems of meaning, continuously reactivated by each new interpretive framework. Whether viewed through the lens of symbolic theology, historical reconstruction, or speculative physics, they remain fundamentally resistant to closure, always shifting between what is seen, what is said, and what is imagined. At this final stage of the interpretive sequence, the focus shifts from constructing analytical bridges between ancient language and modern scientific imagination toward consolidating what these narrative structures actually accomplish within cultural, historical, and cognitive systems. Rather than attempting to resolve ambiguity, the goal becomes understanding why such ambiguity persists and why it continues to generate new layers of meaning across time. The narrative tradition surrounding Elijah and Elisha, when viewed through a historical and religious lens, functions primarily as a mechanism of transmission. It is not merely a record of events, but a structured memory system in which authority, continuity, and legitimacy are encoded through symbolic language. Elijah's role is not only that of a prophetic figure, but also that of a transitional node within a broader theological lineage. His departure, whether interpreted as ascent, disappearance, or transformation, serves a structural purpose. It marks the transfer of spiritual authority to Elisha. In this sense, the narrative operates less like a historical chronicle and more like a ritualized framework for continuity within a belief system. This continuity is essential. In many ancient traditions, legitimacy is not anchored solely in institutions or documented succession, but in narrative coherence. Stories preserve authority by embedding it within symbolic events that transcend ordinary historical causality. The ascent motif, therefore, is not an anomaly, but a functional narrative device. It ensures that leadership is not simply replaced, but transformed and reauthorized through a dramatic act that exceeds ordinary perception. When modern interpretive frameworks introduce analogies from quantum theory, such as superposition, multiple states of existence, or parallel realities, these concepts are often used metaphorically rather than literally. Quantum mechanics, in its formal scientific context, describes probabilistic behavior of particles at microscopic scales, governed by precise mathematical formalisms. However, when these ideas are extended into cultural or textual interpretation, they become metaphorical tools rather than direct explanatory models. The notion of multiple realities existing simultaneously can be rhetorically appealing when applied to ancient narratives, but it does not imply that such narratives encode or anticipate quantum physical principles. Instead, what these analogies reveal is a cognitive tendency, the desire to frame unresolved symbolic ambiguity using the most conceptually advanced language available. Quantum terminology becomes a modern metaphorical reservoir for expressing uncertainty, multiplicity, and interpretive openness. In this sense, the application of quantum ideas to ancient texts says more about contemporary interpretive habits than about the original content of the texts themselves. From this perspective, the story of Elijah and Elisha can be organized into three distinct but overlapping layers of reading. The first is the historical social layer, in which the narrative reflects possible real-world transitions in leadership, community structure, or cultural memory within the ancient Levant. This layer treats the text as a culturally situated document embedded in specific geographic and historical conditions. The second layer is the mythopoetic or symbolic layer, where events are not evaluated according to empirical plausibility, but according to their function within a system of meaning. Here, ascent, fire, and disappearance operate as structured symbols of transformation, authority, and separation from ordinary existence. This layer is not concerned with whether events happened in a physical sense, but with how they construct meaning and maintain coherence within a worldview. The third layer is the speculative interpretive layer, in which modern scientific concepts are used as analogical frameworks. This includes references to higher dimensions, energy states, or non-linear time. However, this layer must be explicitly understood as metaphorical projection rather than empirical reconstruction. It does not claim that ancient authors possessed knowledge of modern physics, nor that their narratives encode scientific principles. Instead, it reflects how contemporary minds reinterpret symbolic material through available intellectual paradigms. Bringing these layers together does not produce a unified explanation. Instead, it produces a structured multiplicity of interpretations that coexist without collapsing into a single authoritative reading. This multiplicity is not a weakness of the text. It is precisely what enables its longevity. Ancient narratives persist because they are not locked into one epistemological framework. They remain adaptable, continuously reinterpreted through shifting cultural, philosophical, and scientific contexts. From a critical standpoint, it is important to emphasize that there is no scientific basis for interpreting the Chariot of Fire as a technological object or physical propulsion system. No archaeological, textual, or physical evidence supports the idea that the narrative describes engineered machinery or natural plasma phenomena in a literal sense. Attempts to frame it as such belong to speculative interpretation rather than historical reconstruction or scientific analysis. What remains significant, however, is not technological plausibility, but symbolic power. The imagery of fire, ascent, and disappearance operates at a level that is not dependent on physical verification. It functions as a cognitive and cultural tool for expressing transitions that are otherwise difficult to articulate. The passing of authority, the boundary between presence and absence, and the transformation of a figure from human actor into enduring narrative symbol. Ultimately, the primary value of these texts lies in their capacity to generate layered interpretation. They do not provide technical descriptions of the world. They construct frameworks through which meaning can be continuously reorganized. Modern references to physics, cosmology, or multidimensional theories, when applied to such texts, should therefore be understood as interpretive instruments rather than evidential claims. In conclusion, the Chariot of Fire and the associated narrative of Elijah should not be reduced to either literal historical event or technological speculation. Instead, they exist as complex symbolic structures that have accumulated meaning across centuries of reinterpretation. Their enduring relevance comes not from what they objectively describe, but from how they allow successive generations to project, question, and reconstruct the boundaries between the physical, the symbolic, and the imagined.